Good evening, everybody, and welcome, and thanks for tuning in. I'm going to do this mostly as a PowerPoint slideshow, which should come popping up any moment. There we go, share. And I've got a PowerPoint slideshow. So I thought I'd title this Care of Bells and Belfries because I wanted to make it a little bit broader than the sort of greasy finger pointing at a picture of a broken thing, and get into some of the wider issues about why we look after bells and belfries. And I'll talk for a while and then leave, I hope, some time for questions at the end, although my ability to control the timing is a bit suspect, I would reckon. I put myself there as amateur bell hanger and professional engineer. The reason is most of what I'm going to talk about today is my opinion, and everybody can have an opinion these days, particularly on social media, but it's a bit of an issue about what is that opinion informed by. So for those who don't know me, I'm a mechanical engineer, have been for many years, and I've been a sort of amateur bell hanger for about 30 years, starting with painting frames and ending up with doing other things, up to taking bells out and putting them back in again. So the question to start with is what's important to the health of ringing? And it goes without saying that we need some bells. I said this is going to start easy and get more technical as we go along. So we might move up the scale in bell pictures. So we need some good bells. This was clip art's version of a teacher. My wife looked at this and said, why have you got a picture of a lady in high heels? But what I was trying to get to is we know, and we have a lot of discussion about we need recruits and we need good teachers. And ART has done a marvelous job, in my opinion, over the last few years. And what I really like to see is the bell maintenance and the bell world get itself up to the same standard of professionalism. And then, not necessarily finally, but the thing we tend to ignore is the stalwart ringer. So for every new potential surprise Maximus ringer, they start off, and we need a band who are going to ring rounds, and then they'll ring lots of rounds, and then they'll ring lots of call changes, and then they'll carry on ringing for Sunday service and doing their duty while our new found expert goes off to more exciting things. And it's always in my mind about how we make life as pleasant as we can for that particular group of people whose ringing is about its social, its community, and its service. And it always heartens me when I go to a tower somewhere on my travels and it looks like a really nice place to be. It looks like a welcoming place to be. And I think we could do more to try and spread that around. Now, I do understand that we work in medieval buildings and we have faculties and we have all sorts of constraints and difficulties, but nevertheless, I'm going to step through some things that I've seen people doing in my travels. I did think at one stage of putting up competitions of good ringing rooms I've seen, but I did recognize that might be a little bit on the divisive side. I also thought about running a competition with this as who could identify most of the bell pictures not in their own tower. So if I get any entries of that, I'll decide whether there's a worthy winner at the end. So let's think a bit about making ringers welcome and comfortable. And there's a number of things we can do. So there's the environment, there's light. When I started ringing, a 40-watt bulb 15 foot up in the ceiling was as good as you were going to get. And you used it to peer at your blue line to try and work out what you were doing. These days, there's two things. Is we've moved to LED panel lights, which are very, very effective and cheap to run. And secondly, there's a trick that you can do that we do in industrial premises where you have wall mounted lights that are not much above the heads of the users, because the brain is tricked into thinking that the ceiling is not far above the lights, because that's what we're used to. And by having the lights brought down a little bit, it gives the room a sort of more of a cozy aspect. You don't have that big empty space above you that is somewhat unusual. So you can make a sort of cozy feeling by bringing your lights down. The second thing is heat. And I did some work on this for my town. Now, basically, there's three things you can do. You can attempt to heat the structure, you can heat the air, or you can try and heat the people. Heating the structure is obviously stupid because it's a big church and you won't. Heating the air works providing your air isn't going out as fast as you're trying to heat it, which is the case in many places. And the best thing to do, in my view, is heat the people. And underneath, I'd put a picture of the Vito radiant fire, and there places have radiant fires around. I went off slightly on the wrong tangent when I did this because I thought I was going to high mount it, and I did all sorts of cunning calculations. But because I was lazy, I only got as far as putting one of them on a table, where I discovered that what it's really good at is melting the chocolates. I would add that actually to the list. I think chocolates are good. Treats are good for those who don't like chocolates. And part of welcoming is saying, well, we rang that really nicely. Let's have a chocolate or another treat. You should put these things on the ground because the human being prefers its feet to be between 2 and 4 degrees hotter than its head. But then you also have to be careful that you don't knock the thing over. This summer, we found quite a lot of places we hadn't really paid enough attention to ventilation, which is either fans or indeed making sure the windows open. And the last one in this package I'm going to talk about is sound control. And I mean a different thing to what we normally use by sound control. So I get involved in a number of sound control projects which are about stopping the neighbours moaning. This is the two things we try and achieve. One is, have we managed to get our bells so that they sound nice and help our ringing while we're ringing them? And two, have we made it so that people can have a sociable time during a practice night and chatter to each other? Because that's what people like doing. And these things, of course, are very much at odds. You can't expect people to concentrate while people are standing behind them having a chat. Apart from where I learned, very curious place in Lancashire, we did actually have conversations while ringing. It was the done thing, and it wasn't until I'd been away from there quite a while I realised what a social pariah I was making myself. But give some thought to people come for a social event. So sitting in the quiet, listening to overloud bells being struck badly is not a particularly social event. So what can we do to try and get a better balance there? Then there's the social bit. I discovered I'm pretty lousy at this because I put this list together, and well, I put some of this list together, and my wife kept coming along and going, oh, you've forgotten this, you've forgotten that. But this is about making a community. One of the things that isn't on the list is a calendar, which I put on. My wife was very exercised about coat hooks. That had never occurred to me. I'm quite happy to throw my clothes on the floor, but apparently not everybody shares that idea. Bits of carpet, comfortable seating, certificates, a bit of celebration, notice boards, thank you cards, even if you have to write them yourself. All this goes some way to building a sense of community amongst our ringers and making it a happy evening event. And then the third category, and I've missed some things off here as well, because these days we also need to have things like the postcode in case you need to call the emergency services and phone numbers and stuff like that. And I'll go through these in a little bit more detail. I'll pick up the two record ones first. So training records and inspection records. I never paid much attention to that whatsoever, but I had a bit of a wake-up call. I think it was about 9 months ago. Some of you may have noticed on Facebook, there was a young gentleman who was learning, and I think he broke a stay and he got a rope burn or I sprained a finger or something like this. And on Facebook, he announced his desire to sue the people, the tower. He was going to sue the instructor for instructing him wrongly, and he was going to sue the steeplekeeper for poor maintenance, because the stay obviously shouldn't have broken. So he obviously was an early stage learner who didn't listen very well. And his case was completely defeated. I mean, it's obviously a fairly rubbish case, but it was completely defeated by the fact that that particular tower, he was on the ART scheme and they got immaculate records, and the steeplekeeper had very good inspection records. Now, up to that point in time, I'd probably go up the stairs about once a month, and I'll always have a look round and I'll check everything's pretty much where it should be, but I'd never actually thought to write it down. But nowadays, when I come down, we have a little notebook that our tower captain writes the names down in, and I write went and inspected bells or moved rope or do something, and all is well. So that's a useful thing to do. First aid kit goes without saying. We're going to get the odd rope burn and splinter and all the rest of it. Fire extinguisher I'm going to come back to later because people have moved ground on that. Toolkit, stuff for doing ropes and tape and maybe a fid for splicing. Your muffles, spare stuff, nuts, bolts, your bells are up, notices. A torch, which reminds me of a thing to worry about with the lighting. You should have an emergency light that comes on when the electricity drops out. And you may think that's sufficient. But in fact, again, the tower I learned at was not unusual in that the switch for the lights was actually outside the ringing room. It was up a short ladder thing, and the lights were at the bottom of the ladder, which is an arrangement you see, I say, fairly commonly. And somebody was so impressed with our ringing one evening that they came and switched the lights off on us. Now, that's not great. It was made even less great by the fact that we'd got a learner and we were teaching that learner to ring down. And teaching a learner to ring down in the dark is a bit of a skill we hadn't quite mastered yet. So if you have that, it's obviously not ideal, but if you do have that, it's worthwhile considering something of having a light that's always on, or light you switch on when you come in, so that if for some reason you do lose the light or somebody switches you off, then you've still got a way of carrying on until you can get the bell sorted and make everybody safe. So that's some stuff on the welcoming. Now we'll move to, oh, no, we won't. We'll move to PPE, the safety bit. So this is the stuff I normally use when I go wandering around bells, and most of it is reasonably self-evident. I wear a bump cap, and the reason I wear a bump cap is because I haven't got much hair and scalp wounds bleed like the very devil, and you really don't want to be up the top of a belfry with a scalp wound. Earmuffs if you want to hear the bells. Footwear, the most important thing in footwear is that it's non-slip, fits and is comfortable. One of the issues I tend to have with people who are new to this is that they do love to show that they're not really worried about heights and anything by jumping around like a newly released gazelle. And all my movements in the belfry, at least ones I don't know, I like to be hanging on by at least 3 limbs at once. And so I don't want to slip off, and I want to move slowly and cautiously. And I want others to do likewise, because while the person leaping around like the gazelle might be enjoying themselves, I don't want them to knock me off either. So good footwear. Over this side, we have some overalls. That doesn't really matter because you can get your clothes dirty, but you will get dirty. You will get your trousers caught on a nail and something like that. So it's good to have something that you don't feel so fussed about. And I normally have a pair of work gloves because I've got bored with trying to get splinters out of my fingers. And here, in the middle here, is my sort of fisherman's jacket. Now, the intent of this is because I don't like wandering around these frames any more than's necessary. I like to carry everything with me in its multitudinous pockets. Those who work with me will know that I then never know what's in which pocket and spend ages faffing about, but it's still better than going backwards and forwards to pick up something from a bag by the door. And the common things we'll have is a tape measure, a notebook, a little tiny adjustable, a plumb bob, can't see the plumb bob very easily, a ventilator, in case we get into somewhere where there might be psittacosis or something of that nature. And here you can't really see it, but that's a head torch. And it's my practice in life to generally have my head torch on and lit at all times, actually, unless it's very, very light in the belfry. And this is because in one of my early manoeuvres in a church out in deepest Huntingdonshire, we were trying to take the crown staples out with an angle grinder when the angle grinder tripped the church electric. So I'm standing on a 4-inch wide beam over a large drop, clutching a winding down angle grinder in the dark. And from that moment, I thought that probably wasn't really good. And if I'd had my head torch on and lit, it would have been a slightly less worrying experience. I've only known, I think, through reading, I haven't known anything, well, I've actually known one accident personally, but in the past sort of 10 years, this is quite safe. It's, I think one person fell in amongst the bells and broke their pelvis, which was not good. And somebody else tripped and managed to stick the dingler of a Hastings stay up through the soft part of the chin, which sounds really gory and horrible. And one of the things that really does drive home, and we don't really want to do gruesome stories, but it really does drive home, don't work on bells on your own. Because although it doesn't happen very frequently, any one of us can slip. And there's lots of hard, shiny, bumpy things up there. So moving on from PPE to tools, this is my sort of light toolbox, and it's mostly for carrying in the back of the car. So when I'm at district practice and the bells go quiet or something goes thump, I can grab this and go up there and maybe I'll be able to fix it. But you don't really need very much at all to fix bells. There's a sort of fid on the left there for doing rope work. There's some whipping twine. This stuff is mostly rubbish. There's a screwdriver, an adjustable spanner, a little sort of adjustable saw thing, set of pliers. That's really, you don't really need much more than that. Some Loctite for when the nuts come undone. So you don't need very much. If you want to do a really big job, then this is the heavy toolkit. And one of the things about the heavy toolkit is I have this rucksack on wheels, and it came to me quite a long time ago that the most chance I stand of doing myself an injury is lugging this stuff up and down the tower and ricking my back. So with this, I've got the option. I can, depending on what the access is, I can carry it as rucksack so I don't have it hanging from one side in the circular stair, or I can put a rope through the handle and pull it up. And then when I'm trudging through the church, I can pull it on a handle. And here I've got a grease gun for places that want a grease gun, castor oil for those that don't, some lubricating oil, roll wrench and grips, hammer for hitting things, a couple of big spanners and a couple of big screwdrivers. In the snobby books, and if I was a proper snobby engineer, I'd say never use an adjustable spanner. But in fact, all the bell hangers do use adjustable spanners. And if you use them properly, i.e. you tighten the jaws up on the nut rather than just sort of being slap happy about it, they're probably better than a fitted spanner, because A, fitted spanners tend to splay or they get chrome jaws, and so they don't actually fit that well. And 2, adjustable spanners tend to be thicker, so you do actually have a bigger jaw area in contact. And then the other thing I've got sitting down here is a collection of spare nuts and a couple of coach bolts. And that's pretty much all I need to fix most things, really. So we're going to go on now as if we were doing some kind of inspection activity. And this picture here, some may recognize, a very nice reordering project took place, and the ringers went upstairs, as is the wont these days. And you may not be able to make out, but this is about, in old money, it's about a foot or so with a barrier on the top. And if I had young toddlers I wanted to park while I was ringing, I wouldn't really be terribly happy at letting them roam on that seat. And this brings into focus a problem that we quite often have these days, which is the church goes in for some reordering and the bell ringers are either not engaged early enough or not engaged at all or not engaged properly. And we end up with situations where we have to end up with some kind of unhappy remedial action, moving ropes or trying to get the floor moved forward at the last minute or whatever it happens to be. And one of the bits of advice I would make is get involved as soon as you can. And if even if you haven't got any doubts, either through me or directly, make contact with the diocesan bell advisor who sees all these plans and can make sure that the ringer's voice is represented. And then hopefully we can make things that are safe and comfortable for the ringers, because architects and people like they just have no clue how much you need to stand and ropes and all the rest of it. This bottom picture here, this is the intro into the fire extinguisher conversation. I went here to do an inspection and I said, well, I think you should have a fire extinguisher, mainly because it was on my checklist. And the person leading me round said that they'd been advised not to by the fire brigade. Now, I do know fire brigades always have a policy that they don't want amateurs messing around with fire extinguishers. They want them to get out. So nowadays they do tend to say, don't have fire extinguishers. But in this particular case, you're exiting down these stairs into the kitchen. Now, if there's likely to be a minor fire, it's likely to be down there in the kitchen. Now, if I've got to go down there and join the fire, I would rather have a fire extinguisher than not, was my particular view, whatever the fire brigade man's recommendation. The other thing you can do instead is you can have a fire blanket, because if you're of that mind, you can use a fire blanket as a shield. So even if you're not confident in putting the fire out with the fire blanket, you can hold it in front of the fire while everybody scuttles past. And you should be able to do that for quite long enough to evacuate your ringing room. So what do we do when we go there? Well, here's a couple of pictures. This is an interesting example of things that are not great practice. So this is a tower with a chancel ring, and anybody can go and ring whenever they like with that spider arrangement. They are aware of this and have been having convoluted plans to have an electric spider for quite a long while. But an easy thing to do is to make sure that your spider is inaccessible to the general public. And if you don't have a locking ring room, then a key box and a conduit to I can't climb past here height is a jolly good substitute. But this is quite dangerous with open churches and people who might come in and just start messing around with bells and have no notion of what they're doing. This is the next thing I generally do. Once we've located the spider, made sure that works and lowered the ropes, give the ropes a good slapping and see if any of these bosses are loose. And sometimes look up and see if these bosses are loose, because by and large, people aren't terribly happy when they fall out and come down the rope, and the screws do loosen from time to time, or these frames do loosen from time to time. So that's well worthwhile putting on your checklist. And this is just an interesting picture of things people do. This is one of a tower. I'm sure somebody recognizes it, but these things here are the balancers for the clock rewinding mechanism. And so somebody stands with their back to them when they're ringing. Now, I'm fortunate that I don't have hair, but if I did, I'd really be quite nervous at those going up and down behind my back. And I think I'd be much happier if they were shielded in some way or another. So the other thing we're going to look for when we're doing our running around the ring room is a chance to talk about ropes. And ropes, quite often we're looking for rotten wear, and especially where the rope isn't exposed to the atmosphere, like the garter hole. And sometimes I've had appalling luck with these little leather gaiters. I've known quite a few bells where they've rotted in the leather gaiter thing that you're supposed to put in the garter hole. And similarly, I have a real aversion to people putting tape on ropes anywhere other than the end instead of whipping the end. I think it's okay to put a bit of tape on the end rather than whip it, but other than that, tape can promote rot underneath it as well. We are lucky in the district, we do have an expert in ropes that we can go to, which is Phil. But what we're just looking for on these things is the tops. Very often, for the less financially well-endowed towers, there will be splices. We're looking for splices going through holes and splices getting caught in holes. And is that the best place for a splice? We look at the sallies. Sallies, when they're new, are about 2 inches. You can, if you let your sallies get very, very small, it's very hard on people with poor grip. And you know, people who have to wear gloves and stuff for the grip. If you're going to offer them a 1-inch salary on a heavy bell, that's going to make life slightly unnecessarily difficult for them. And sometimes you see fluff shedding, where the sallies are getting caught in the bosses, and you've probably got a sharp edge or something up there that you need to go and pay attention. And for tail ends, the things I mostly look at is, are they absolutely gross and horrible and could do with cleaning up? And how good are the tucks and the tuck security? Some people are more keen to have knots than others, and knots and boxes. I must admit, I'm not that anti-knot if you just put it in for a while and take it out, but it is a much better if you can adjust the ropes and keep them approximately the right height. And in my tower, we have the height of all the ropes, or the height of the bottom of the sally, for the right level. I've got written up on a board so that if we change a rope, we know what height to set it to, and we can measure it, and we can set it to that height rather than having to go up, down, shouting up the stairs, which has never worked tremendously well for me. You can have 2 sorts of rope, as we all know, natural and synthetic, and obviously people have a synthetic top and a natural bottom. There's always a lot of debate on the Facebook groups about who you go to for your ropes, and inevitably, whichever rope maker is mentioned, somebody will say they've had a stretchy set and somebody else will say they've used them for years and it's been wonderful. I've sort of formed the conclusion that it must be something to do with the batching, where they get the original material from, in that the heat treatment is obviously a bit of a erratic process, and pretty much most of them have suffered from stretchy ropes from time to time. We've had a couple in the district which have been irremediable. Well, it doesn't seem to be much way around that. It's a bit of a lottery. And also, depending on how much money you've got as a tower, you've really got the option of buying new ropes, which some towers can do every now and again, and generally they very kindly pass on their old ropes to less well-endowed towers. Or you can treat them as 3 component parts, and you can splice in new tops new sallies or new bottoms as they get worn out. And if you haven't got much money, I think it's well worth teaching yourself splicing. Splicing takes about 20 minutes. It's easily learnt off YouTube or watching pictures. And the secret is it doesn't have to be that good. Even a rubbish looking splice is well strong enough for what we're trying to do. And you know, you may worry that you can't taper the ends off nicely and get it even and all the rest of it, but practically it doesn't really matter that much in terms of the strength. So a few words about access. Now, here we have some ladders. And if we look at these two, this one you think is quite nice. I suppose the first thing is the wood rotten. That's always worth inspecting from time to time. This one is quite nice in that when you get off up here, you step into the intermediate chamber fairly easily, but it's really hampered by the fact there's no room at the bottom. And you can see a similar one here where this is quite a nice looking ladder, but how on earth you insert yourself in here, I don't know. And this one's a more conventional sort of ladder. There's two things about, I suppose there's one thing about access in general, which is if you have poor access, people don't inspect the bells. It's a sort of trait of human nature. There's one particular tower that had for a while a very, very whippy ladder, an aluminium ladder, and people were not at all keen on going up there. And it was eventually solved by put a bracing piece into the wall. So make sure you can have a ladder that people go up. The other thing, and this applies also to access into the rigging rooms itself, is make sure that there are handrails above the ladder so that people can do what you're supposed to do, which is you walk on your feet up the ladder until your feet are at the level with the floor, and then you step off sideways. Rather than people, there's no handholds, they're facing the wall and they kind of do a bottom shuffle and a turn sideways and all the rest of it. That's the place where you're likely to get slips and stumbles. Whereas a couple of nice handrails through here where you can just go straight up, step off, step sideways, job done. We're not all ladders, of course. Quite often we have spiral staircases. And one of the tricks with spiral staircases is they are part of the quinquennial. But architects have an awful lot to do. So if your stairs are worn, make sure it gets pointed out to the architect and get them mended, because they're quite cheap to get mended. While we're going up there, we'll have a look at beams, and we're really just looking to see if anything's rubbing against them and whether they're going rotten or splitting. So that's the sort of thing we do on our travels. And then here's a couple of examples that sort of make a point. Now, there was a whole thread of argument about whether you pocket your beams or you cement them in. We won't particularly go into that, but you can see this bottom one here is there's some wooden beams and there's some carpety matting stuff, and it's all a bit damp and it's all a bit sort of rotten-ish. This one is a nice metal beam that's let into the wall and is clean. We can see what it's doing and we're quite happy. The secret with these things is to make sure that you have plenty of air around the beam and you prevent any kind of water access. If you can do that, this will carry on for probably the next 400 years. But if you let rubbish build up and you let damp build up, it's an invitation for the place to rot, particularly in the bit where it goes into the wall. So water will tend to run down walls, churches, roofs leaking and all that kind of problem. And then you rot the end of your beam, and then you are in quite a degree of sort of problem. So one of the things we'll look at, keep this all as clean, tidy, as much air circulation as you can possibly manage. These metal beams, they also will rust actually if you let the water come down the wall on them as well. So the same thing applies to a degree to keep it as clean and tidy as you can. This is one of the things we're looking for. So this is all a bit rotten and skanky. Unless you've got a lot of experience, it's quite hard to judge whether that's good or bad. This has got a wedge in it. Unfortunately, it's only got one wedge. It should have two going in opposing directions. And this is actually a bit of a frame, and this is showing you this yellow powder here, which is a sign that you've got active woodworm going on today. And then you need to get woodworm treatment infestation people in. If you've got a lot of rot in your beams, then you have to get a structural engineer in or somebody who's experienced in old beams to tell you how good it is. I can kind of do a rule of the thumb. I see how much of the beam is left by poking it with a knife. And then if we've got lots left, apart from the rotten bit, then I'll be feeling more cheerful than if it all falls out. That brings us up to the bell chamber. Now, the bell chamber, you save yourself an awful lot of trouble if you can achieve these things. If you can make it windproof, if you can make it bird-proof, and if you can make it rain-proof. So the first and always thing to check is very often they have netting to make sure that netting's there and it's not broken. If the church is willing to let you do that, then there's a product called Gale Breaker that can stop the rain flooding in. That's quite a useful product. But you have to do your best. The better you can keep the environment nice in here, then the better, the easier the bells are to maintain. The better it's clean, because as I said before, the dirt and all the rest of it attracts moisture, which then leads to rot. While we're up here, we'll inspect the sound control, if we've got it, and we'll inspect, we're looking for some form of lighting, hopefully in our nice, clean, dry bell tower. And if you've had a bird infestation and you're doing the cleaning up, that's when you need to wear the ventilator mask to avoid psittacosis. Now, one of the things that people expect me to do that I don't generally do is observe the bells. You see the bells swinging merrily here. Bells exert their sort of biggest forces on the frame when they're about 2/3, 3/4 the way up. So actually you only need to ring them up that far. Also, from a safety point of view, mechanical engineers, you never stand in line with things, and most engines so on, you never stand at right angles either. But in this particular case, I'll let you know I'm sheltering behind this beam and using my mobile phone. And this bell has the odd problem every now and again, and you can't really see it from the video at all. And what I normally do is I ask somebody if any of the bells doesn't go very well, and then I try and diagnose the problem before getting round to ringing the bells. So bad going is normally this set. The first thing to look at is rope runs and pulleys, and I'll show you a picture of a pulley later on, but they have an enormous effect on how well a bell goes. Things like splices catchy on things, catchy on the edge of things, and so on. The fixings, is the bell actually secured to the headstock? And we'll talk about that in a bit in a moment, but you can easily put your foot on the bell and hang on the wheel and see if there's any kind of movement. And there's another way of seeing movement we'll get to in a moment. The bearings, more a case of in plain bearings, sometimes you do get a failed or a near failing of a plain bearing, but that's very, very rare. Rubbing things and hitting things, I'll show you a picture later on, rubbing headstocks or hitting stays or something like that. And finally, the one where you're most likely to have to actually ring the bell is frame movement. But even then, ringing one bell isn't terribly informative, because the frame movement might stem from some other bell that's actually causing a bell to go badly. So for example, if one bell is hung at right angles to the other, the movement in the frame might pinch the bearing of that particular bell. And you won't be able to see that unless, of course, you ring all the bells, which can be quite a tricky pastime. Rope runs and pulleys we always inspect on the way up. You can see this is a nice box, but it's bearing against the edge of that box. We've got a nice boss there, so we can be happy about that. We've got some scrot on the floor, which we're less happy about, because that'll bit of plastics, ideal for trapping some moisture. It's quite a wide pulley. It looks like it was a Sally pulley at one stage, and you can see it's losing its lip. It's reasonably badly worn, but it's also had the lip comes off, so we need a new one. These also have various forms of lubrication, which people tend to ignore. And this one is quite a common problem, that there's the pulley doing its pulley thing, and it's not terribly well illustrated here because of the you don't get much light, but you can see it's shiny across the top there. So what's happened is the pulley is so worn, through probably 3/4 of the stroke, the rope is actually rubbing on the top of the block, not doing any pulley thing at all. And that's really just down to the pulley itself being too worn. So always check the tops of these blocks and that there's no witness mark on them. Now, I thought I'd just do a little bit of engineering just to keep my hand in. So most of the places I go, we spend some of our time searching for the nuts on the floor, which isn't bad steeple keeping, it's just how it is. And this is how fasteners work, 101, that students singularly fail to be interested in. But basically, here's a bolt, here's a nut, we do the nut up and we stretch the bolt up till there. And the stretch bolt creates a load up and down here. And because everything's got to be equal and opposite, that load creates a clamping load in these two bits of wood. Now, should these two bits of wood then shrink, there is no clamping load, there is no extension on this bolt here, it will go back to there, and that distance will probably be about 3 or 4 thou, not very much at all. And then this nut will have no tension on it. And because it's in a vibrating system, because that's what most bells are, then it will vibrate its way off. So one of the things we have to do when we go up is we have to check all the nuts and bolts on headstocks, clappers, wheels, stays, to make sure that they're all present. And it's particularly relevant when we've had a long hot summer like we did last year. So we had a lot of loose stuff last year, and it's to do with this wood shrinking. So important, if it's long and it's hot, go up and check that everything's tight and take a few spare nuts in your pocket. Wheels, not a lot to be said about wheels. By looking at where the rope's running, you can see how straight it is and whether the wheel is worn. This wheel, A, it's running to one side, or with photographs to one side, and 2, it seems to be hitting something on this side here. And quite often wheels go out of line. Irritatingly, it's quite often due to the fact that we tread on the wheel braces when we're wandering around. And the other thing that happens with wheels is that the rims split off. These little nails that they're nailed on with will rust, and then the rimming splits off. And it's a kind of DIY carpenter basis to mend that. We get to sliders. Here is a very nice steam slider doing its thing. Nothing particularly untoward with that. This one you can't see very well. It's got quite a lot of wear. And I was introduced not many years ago to graphite dust, graphite powder, which you can get on the internet, and it really does do a much better job of lubricating the slider than any oily, greasy, sticky concoction. And that cuts down a lot of that wear and makes the sliders go much easier. And one of the reasons for trying to be nice to sliders is they are hellish to make. You can make one of those, but you have to do it, or we would do it by laminating bits of ply. It's quite a tedious pastime if you're not familiar with how to steam bits of ash. And this one is just the, well, actually, it is a slight problem in that for whatever reason, I don't know how it got like this, but the slider's hitting the frame there, which would have made things slightly more difficult. But the reason I put it in was to, people complain about the set. The way you adjust the set is just by adjusting that either by sticking a little block on it or cutting a little block off it. But one of the things you have to do is make sure you know which you're doing and which is the hand stroke set and which is the backstroke set. So you need to be clear that with everybody out the way, you ring the bell up, mark out which is which, then go and ring the bell down and make whatever adjustment you want to make. Stays. Here's a jolly fine example. One undersized coach bolt and nothing. So we really need 2 coach bolts bolted through and the right size. Unfortunately, these tend to be imperial and these tend to be metric, and the metric heads don't fit through that hole, which I suspect is why that's like it is. I actually turn the heads of mine down so they do fit. And then stays, you can see this is a really nice crack stay, and this was actually in situ, so this was just waiting for a nice sort of learner to experience their first stay breakage. This is a Hastings stay, more complicated. So you've got the dingler and the head of the thing. Somebody asked about changing them. They're no different to changing than any other stay, apart from the fact that you have to be fiendishly accurate, because if you see this, you know, if you go a little bit further up there, it won't engage, and if you come down too far, the stay will hit this particular slider mechanism, and then the bell will rub. So with a Hastings stay, the carpentry's got to be cleverer to get that the dimension of the cap right and to get the length right, and you've got to be within about ½ an inch, whereas normally with a stay you can be within a couple of inches without anything going bad. We look inside the bells. This is just for interest, really. If your screen's good enough, you can see this is a virgin bell. It's just been chip tuned, and you can see the little hammer marks. This one, we've got quite a bit of clapper movement. It's called clapper roll. So we can show that the clapper's going from side to side. So we're worried about that. This one's quite interesting. I don't know why it's spalling it. Maybe it's had a new clapper of an over hard metal, but you can definitely see it had its clapper here once, and then it had its clapper here once. So it's obviously been turning for some particular reason, and it's wearing quite a big hole. There has been an era where the bell hangers got into quite hard clappers, which has caused quite a lot of bell wear. And if it gets to be more than 10%, you have to turn the bell, which is a little annoying. And here we have some clappers. Now you can get anything with clappers. So here, these lucky people have got a bit of wood and a bit of leather. These lucky people have got the bit of leather and some steel on steel, and they're missing a bolt. These people have got hopefully a bronze bush, which is grease lubricated with a Stauffer lubricator, and normally you find these caps have fallen off or on the floor and nobody knows what to do with them, but I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. And this is a dry one that seems to be slightly unscrewed. I think it's a dry one, which has no lubrication. And the bell hangers have gone through lots of iterations, each hoping that the next one will be the best one, but without too much success, really, in my view. I still like proper lubrication. And here's one that I went to shortly before a district meeting where the bolt's on its way out somewhere else, and we were lucky to detect it because this bolt can actually come out and then your clapper can go flying across the room, causing all sorts of different bits of mayhem. And this is just to show what the top of these things is. That's just normal top of a staple, and this is the bit of wood, a metal bracket and a leather insert. And one of the reasons I mention this is one of my sidelines is odd struckness, and if you ask me to do something about that, that's perfectly feasible. These things, there's very little you can do. With a lot of patience, you can make a new wooden block, but in terms of having any adjustment of the striking, it's next to impossible. And this says the same thing, because that's how you do it. You have your little resin pad, you put your washer in and you tilt the head. Of course, with the bits of wood and all the rest of it, that can all go anywhere. This just shows you, so people ask me, once I've said that's the stuff a lubricator and you should be lubricating, they look a bit mystified as to how it works. So there's the thing taken apart, and there's a cap. You fill the cap with grease, you screw the cap on, and the grease comes out the little hole, which is in the middle of your clapper, or in this case, it's a pulley box. And when you've got the cap filled up, it only goes down, and you should have about 3 or 4 threads left. And then every time you do your lubrication visit, you give it half a turn until you can turn it no more, and then you take it off and fill it. But they are inherently inclined to fall off. A few more things before we end. So headstocks and fixings. This is a nice metal one. This will come to no great harm. This one will suffer from the, it could be loose if the stock changes. So these need regular checking that they're tight. That one's split, that one's very split. So that's always worth looking out for. And here's a tip from the top. You don't actually need to check all these things to see if they're tight. Loose straps and bolts, and in fact, loose nuts shed this red powder. So if you see the red powder, you know that the thing's been loose. Even if it's not now, it's been loose. That's an example of it managed to rub on the frame. And here's somebody improvising with lock nuts, and it's worthwhile having, I don't actually like these castle nuts because you always end up with it slightly looser than you want. So a nut and a lock nut I prefer. But in the absence of that, two castle nuts is as good as anything. I did play with this merely for my light amusement, which was to say, well, when you tighten these things up, because it looked like Bob Minimus really, and I was suffering withdrawal symptoms. If you tighten these two up first and then those two, whichever order, you pull the bell in that direction, you can make it more or less odd struck. If you tighten these two up and then those two, or vice versa, you can pull the bell sideways and you can make it clamp the frame. So what we want to do is we want to do it on the diagonal. So that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. And also with this, there's a standard health and safety. You never sort of push hard on a spanner or pull on a spanner when you've not braced yourself, so that if the spanner falls off or the nut shears or something like that, you don't go careering backwards. You should always be very nicely braced. And if the thing breaks, you're still just happily standing there. Finally, a couple of bearings. So here's yet another stay with one bolt, one scabby bolt. And so that's kind of standard bearing. The thing with these bearings is mostly you just leave them alone. I'll show you one that wasn't in a moment, but they go on pretty much forever. Unlikely that there's something wrong. This is the brass bearing, and then they need to be lubricated. Fill that with castor oil. Some of them have a wick pad on the top, some don't, but you fill that. And about once every 20 years or whatever, you need to poke this out to make sure that it's not full of crap, because otherwise you can't get any oil in there. And this is an example of people used to think it was a good idea to put grease in these bearings, but in fact, these bearings are supposed to only be 1/3 full of grease. And of course, if over 50 years you keep pumping more in, you blow the seals, the bearing's full of grease, so it's got more resistance than it would otherwise, and you get a really crappy mess coming down on the inside of the bell. Finally, where can you get help from? There's the bell advisors team. So each district has a bell advisor, and they're always happy to come out and play. The DAC has a bell advisor who gets to see all the paperwork going to the DAC, all the faculty applications. There are bell hangers, always in the diary, always keen to help. The CCBR, they used to have a lot of good stuff, but on the new website, they took their stuff down and they haven't managed to get it all back up yet. In fact, they haven't managed to get much of it at all back up yet, but I'm hoping eventually they will come back. They've got good stuff on sound control. And then they published this manual of belfry maintenance, which is, I did discuss this with my favorite bell hanger, and we kind of sniffed a little bit, but we reckoned it was mostly okay. So that's it. I've now got not much time for questions.
Hi, thank you very much, Tom. It was a fantastic talk, and obviously we've got quite a lot of questions to get through. I don't know whether you'll particularly push for time, but we can certainly run over if that's okay with you. So I don't know whether you can see there's 8 questions or so in the Q&A, and there's a few in the chat window. So I don't know whether probably the easiest one is just to go through the ones in the Q&A, and then we can mop up the ones in the chat later, maybe.
Yep. So starting with Phillips, do you have an opinion about liquid chalk? The answer is I don't really like it, but if people need it, then fair enough. I sort of live with it. I would prefer to have nice sallies. Quite often people are using liquid chalk because the tower's got miserable sallies. What do you recommend for cleaning tail ends? So I haven't studied this, but what you see mostly on Facebook is taking them off and just putting them in buckets of soapy water. It's normally just greasy crud. So I think that generally does the job. Main thing is making sure that they're dry. Stretchy ropes from Sue, if you get a stretchy rope. I would, first of all, I'd pre-stretch the rope. So I'd do the normal thing of hanging a weight on it for a while. I wouldn't wait too long, to be honest. I think, you know, if the bells are unreasonably regularly, or if somebody were willing to have a go on a quarter peal or something like that, I think, you know, in a month to 2 months, it isn't going to get much better. And I'd go back and start making a fuss, and then at least you've sort of declared your hand. What is a wheel brace? A wheel brace is generally a small bit of feeble metal that runs from the wheel to the headstock and makes an ideal foothold until you discover you've bent the wheel. They come in different forms, but their purpose, and there's normally 2 either side, is to try and keep the wheel straight and square to the headstock. Can you use nylocks? Yes, I quite like nylocks. The only problem with a nylock is that you're only supposed to use it once, and people tend not to, and they are quite expensive. Is there any benefit in a Hastings stay? From Louisa? No, I don't particularly think so. I think that it is a slightly smaller installation, but I prize the ability to do fairly quick stay replacement, particularly if you've got a tower where you've got a lot of learners. And it used to be that the cynical would say that the bell hangers made stays so that they had the stay replacement market. And they used to do very cunningly tapered stays so that the stay lined up with the center line of the bell, and it made it very difficult to make them yourself. And I've never seen any particular benefit in that, and a nice bit of ash that you can keep a few spares in the corner is great for learners. When rebushing a clapper, do you have a yeah, I'm a bronze person, and I've seen a very, I don't know if you've seen it, John, I've seen a very nice thread that somebody put up on Facebook about going to the hangars and every time saying, we've got this new sort of clapper and this is going clapper bushing and this is going to be wonderful. And then 2 years later, he writes back going, oh, well, this one's gone broken now. They come along and say, well, we've got another one. I didn't say, but the way that you measure clapper wear is how much lift you can put in it vertically. And with a bronze one, you only want 1 or 2 millimeters of lift. The only thing I would say against bronze is actually I prefer lubricated bronze to oil light, and that won't work well if you don't lubricate it. If your clappers are rusty, can you rub them down and repaint them? I don't think I'd paint the ball bit where it hits the bell, because that'll do something weird and slightly odd to the sound, or it might do something really odd to the sound. But certainly, yes, you can paint the rest of it. Can you polish the bells? Yes, if you wish. I don't know that I would, but yeah, you can do that. Right, what should I do now, Dave?
Right.
Hit the chat button.
Yeah, well, so I can just rattle through them. So a couple of questions in from Roger Beeman. There's a couple on lubrication. So is there any form of lubrication recommended for Hastings guides along the Dingler slides along? And also on lubrication, any recommendation for lubricant for clappers, especially if they haven't been rebushed in recent years? Or sorry, if they have been rebushed in recent years, sorry.
So for clappers, if they've got a greaser, then a standard medium grease does fine. For the Hastings, I think this is another slight pain with the Hastings because they are metal on metal. Therefore, in theory, it should be a grease that you put on them. But then you do run into the trouble of, attracting dirt and crap and making a grinding paste. So ideally, if you've got it clean and dry, you might just get a nice shiny surface and be able to get away with a minimum of lubricant, but it's not an ideal situation.
Okay, and also following up, still Roger, on Hastings, do tailors maintain records of stays that they supply, and are they able to provide specific stays for installations?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I advise anyway that when you mend a stay or when you take your stays out, that you dimension them, and you want to dimension them before they're broken, and that way it's fairly easy to get replacements. Particularly dimension the hole drilling size, because actually getting the hole straight and square through the bottom of the stay with a shortish kind of drill is quite a tricky thing. You do end up drilling from both sides and missing in the middle. So knowing what the dimensions are and drilling them straight in a workshop makes stay fitting so much better. But I don't think tailors keep that, but it's worthwhile doing it yourself.
Question from Chris Hinkins. Asks, what's a good height to set the
Sally?
Sally. Yeah, what's a good height to set the Sally at from the floor?
Oh, I think I'm going to have to sort of guess from memory here. I've got a feeling ours are about sort of 65 inches. What I did was I took the range of ringers and measured their stretch, and then put the middle of my Sally to the middle of the ringers stretch, and made sure that the small people could catch the bottom and the tall people weren't off the top. And because we ring normally with the same band, mine are set for where people normally ring. So we had short people on 2 and 3, so I have those a little bit lower. And we normally have tall people on 5 and 6, so I have those a bit higher. So I prefer to tailor it to the band you've got. But you need to measure the people's reach, and you need to know where the sallies are when the bells are up, because sallies when the bells are down may be in a slightly different place if the gart hole's not in exactly the right position.
Yeah, that's good. And actually that covered another question that was put, which is, to be observant of the difference in the Sally up-down position. A note from Sue Marsden says that she thinks that the old CC website content is still available if you know the magic commands, and it's true. You can indeed get through. And I just wanted to also, there was a question quite early on from Ian Hamilton about the use of a respirator or ventilator, and what was that about? But I think we did actually cover that later on, when you talked about going into areas where
Psittacosis. That's a safety thing if you've had birds in, or if you are particularly sort of sensitive to dust.
Yeah. You'll notice that there's a few more questions come through on the Q&A, so I don't know whether you want to have a go at those.
I can't really answer Sue's about why some towers take pride in their answer. Some, of course, are very difficult to rectify, to be fair. So if you've got casted staples, they are difficult. Although, having said that, we've recently done one where they've gone very odd struck because the leather all worn away, and it got much better when we replaced the leather. Some people think that if you can teach people to cope with odd struckness, that gives them a sort of benefit for the rest of their ringing career. And I think other people just don't know the bells are odd struck. It's almost worth a session in its own right, really, about what's odd struckness. And I think, David, your experience of hawk ear, you kind of probably know more than I do about knowing where the start of a row is and what the interval is and what people can determine or not.
I think probably I know that I know less than I used to about it.
All right. Yes, exactly. That's always a sign of learning. I don't know if you know Brian Moore, who's a world-leading expert in psychoacoustics. I've had good conversations with him about what is practically detectable in odd struckness and how it varies from person to person. Philip says ho ho. Yes. Philip nearly got the prize for having his ringing room up as the exemplar ringing room, actually, if I'd managed to find a better picture of it. Is it necessary to give the wheel wood treatment? Yes, so this is the one John did in earlier. The answer should be no. If your tower is clean and tidy. Wheels, originally they were made of oak or other close-grained timber with elm rims and ash soling. And as you see from medieval times, there's lots of old oak around with no treatment whatsoever. And it seems perfectly happy. A few towers of my acquaintance have painted their wheels, but it is relatively few. Most just leave them. Clive wants to go back to pulleys, but I think it's a bit it's a bit late for that, really. That was at 8:34.
What I'll do is certainly the video will be on the district YouTube channel, so it'd be possible to go back and review anything that was missed at the time. And Tom has also kindly said that he's happy to provide a copy of the slides if anyone does want a copy of them. So if you do, you'll get a follow-up email tomorrow night, which has got our contact details. So it's got my contact details in. So do get in touch if you'd like a copy of the slides. Oh, in fact, I see Philip has just asked that very question. So
yes.
Yeah.
Although I will say to Philip that the slides I've got multiple pictures on one slide because it's an animation, but the one that I'll put up will have the pictures separated. Otherwise, they all overlap each other. So it'll be slightly different, but everything will be there. How big is the biggest spider? Is this a you show me mine, I'll show you yours type question? I think, Mark, you should run a biggest spider competition for the district. It would be a bit like an I Spy. It'd be fun.
Okay. Well, I think that seems to be the end of the flow of questions. Hopefully we've covered everything. So just once again, thank Tom very much. It's been an excellent talk. Very, absolutely fantastic format of going through what are we trying to achieve, and then how do we actually go about achieving it. So it's been absolutely fantastic. Just to mention that we've got a couple more webinars in the pipeline. We've got David Pipe speaking on Friday with an introduction to conducting, and Mark Davis is speaking about an introduction to a composition a week today. And so looking forward to both of those. And you'll probably also have noticed that Gareth Davis has published the details of his next webinar, which is going to be on Thursday, the 7th of May, which we're expecting to be very popular again. So thank you very much, Tom. I think all the feedback says, yeah, thank you very much for giving the talk to the district and the wider audience. So we'll call it a night there.
Been a pleasure. Thank everybody for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Bye.